The storm came down in thick, icy sheets as Natalie pulled her rental car into the sprawling parking lot of Denver International Airport. The strange, angular roof of the terminal jutted against the darkened sky, its peaks and valleys glowing faintly under the floodlights. She glanced at the time on her phone and sighed. Another delay. Her connecting flight to Seattle was now pushed to morning, and the thought of spending the night here filled her with an odd unease she couldn't quite place. Inside, the terminal was vast and eerily quiet for its size. The usual hum of airports, announcements, footsteps, hurried voices, seemed muted, like sound itself was swallowed by the endless expanse of glass and steel. She wandered past an enormous mural on the wall, its colors jarring under the harsh overhead lighting. A child clutching a wilted flower surrounded by flames. A soldier with hollow eyes and a gas mask. It didn't feel like art. It felt like a warning. Natalie stopped in front of the plaque below the mural. It bore a dedication she didn't quite understand, something about a New World Commission. The words seemed to blur the longer she stared at them, as if her eyes refused to focus. She backed away, bumping into a maintenance worker pushing a mop bucket. The man looked at her sharply, his eyes darting to the mural, then back to her. He said nothing, only turned his head slightly, as if listening to something just beyond the edge of sound. Then he walked away, his wet mop leaving faint streaks that seemed to shimmer. She shook it off and headed toward the escalators. Her hotel voucher was burning a hole in her pocket, and she needed a bed before paranoia set in. But when she reached the map kiosk, she hesitated. The layout of the airport looked wrong. Not just big, wrong. Lines that should have connected didn't. Certain sections seemed to loop back into themselves, and others led to nowhere. Her head started to ache as she tried to make sense of it. She turned around, intending to head back to the main concourse, but the signs had changed. Baggage claim was no longer to her right, it was to her left. Or had it always been that way? The air felt heavy, tinged with the faint metallic taste of blood. She tried to ask a passing security guard for help, but the words stuck in her throat. The guard's face was impassive, his eyes unnervingly blank. He pointed toward an elevator at the far end of the hall. Natalie stepped into the elevator, the doors closing behind her with a finality that made her stomach lurch. The buttons were strange, labeled with symbols she didn't recognize. She pressed one at random. The elevator groaned to life, descending far longer than she expected. The walls seemed to close in, and the air grew colder. When the doors opened, she was in a corridor, stark and white, lit by fluorescent lights that buzzed like flies. She thought it might be a service level until she noticed the symbols painted on the walls. A snake coiled around a globe, a pyramid with an eye. There was no indication of how to return to the surface. She walked forward, the sound of her heels echoing unnaturally. The corridor led to a vast room filled with rows of monitors and consoles. Screens flickered with surveillance footage, terminals, parking lots, and tunnels. But some showed things that didn't belong. Deserts, oceans, places that shouldn't have been connected to an airport. In one feed, a family sat at a dining table, frozen in mid-laughter. In another, a man stared straight into the camera, his face unblinking. She stepped closer and realized the man was in the room with her, standing in the shadows near the far wall. She tried to run, but her legs felt sluggish, as if the air had thickened around her. The man approached slowly, his movements deliberate. He wasn't dressed as staff, nor as a passenger. His face was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were too bright. like the glow of the blue Mustang statue she'd seen when she arrived. "You shouldn't be here," he said without moving his lips. The words slammed into her mind like a physical blow, and the lights in the room dimmed. Natalie stumbled back, hitting one of the consoles. Alarms blared, not in sound but in sensation, filling her head with a piercing noise she couldn't escape. The man, or whatever he was, extended a hand toward her, and she realized with dawning horror that his fingers were impossibly long, curling like tendrils of smoke. Natalie turned and fled, the corridor stretching endlessly before her. She could hear footsteps behind her, but when she glanced back, there was nothing. The elevator wasn't where she remembered. None of the doors led to the terminal. She was trapped in a maze, and the walls themselves seemed to pulse as if alive. Her breathing grew ragged, her heart pounding in her ears. Somewhere in the distance, she heard a voice whispering her name, soft and coaxing, like a lover calling her home. And then, the lights went out.